Shall we start off? Thank you for coming along, everyone. It's good to see so many people, and I think we have people listening in on streaming as well. How are you enjoying the conference so far? Yay, that's pretty good for all right, so my talk today then is resilience, how to bring your best through your worst, or at least through adversity. I should be polite and introduce myself first. My name is John Clapham. I'm a Bristol-based Agile consultant and professional coach. I like to talk about these two things separately on the grounds that being an Agile consultant contains a high degree of knowledge transfer and sort of co-creating stuff by sharing knowledge about that I have in my head and the context of the organization I'm working in. Whereas, of course, professional coaching really is about bringing as little as possible and just creating a thinking environment. So the degree of knowledge transfer is negligible. I need to start off with a safety check, first of all. Does anyone in the room or streaming suffer from jangelophobia? This is a fear of jelly. Okay, good. I have no hands here. Right, I have a tentative hand. If there are any issues, feel free to duck out behind the curtain. And of course, like all phobias, it's not the jelly that's the problem, it's some memory associated with it, and that's about where my reading stopped. I decided it probably wasn't good to know why people were so scared of jelly. If this was a TED Talk, I would stand here confidently, and I would probably talk in the frame of some of my personal experience, some adversity that I had overcome, like there's a TED Talk about, well, for instance, Bear Grylls. He broke his back, and he went beyond resilience. He recovered and started to thrive as a result. These major life-changing things that we hear about. But what I wanted to do today was not so much draw on that and not talk about these seemingly quite distant figures that we see in the media, and try and bring it right down to earth and down to our sort of daily crafts and how we go about building good digital products and building great teams and generally getting through the stresses of life and work. So I'd just like to start with a story. It's a building in London. It's a grey day. It's a grey building in a grey office with a grey carpet and grey chairs. And I'm sitting with a coaching client, and has gone away. Sorry, the microphone's fading a bit. So the coaching client has gone away. When someone goes away in coaching, it means that they're thinking deeply about something. You don't necessarily hear what that thing is, but it's a great sign you've created a successful thinking environment. And maybe there's some mobility, or we sometimes talk about a blinding flash of the obvious. Something has occurred to that person, and they're just in silence. And as a coach, your job is to hold that space for them, to think and explore. And then when they come back, you can decide what to do about that thing. The person I have in mind was actually coming to the conclusion and actually starting to cry at this point. And the emotion, again, is a sign, it's not judged, it's just a sign of deep thinking and relationship with those thoughts. Coming to a conclusion they're going to have to leave a role that they really love, heavily invested in the cause. They've been there for 3 or 4 years, done everything they can to try and further Agile, to role model, evangelize, but being kind of harassed or persecuted from their perspective by a manager. Interestingly, the manager is regarded by the organization as being highly agile, and the manager is sort of put on a pedestal as an example. And so this person then is basically coming to terms with a tough decision, leaving a cause that they love, people that they've worked hard with, go and do something else with a lesser cause. I'm sat there thinking to some extent about what's happening to me. The coaching conversation is confidential, and what the client doesn't know is that this is the third such conversation I've had with an influential manager in that week. So in other words, there's a person coming to see me as a coach who are suffering from the same problem and the same challenges with this particular person. And then the next thing that happens about a week later is the person resigns. They leave their team. Turns out the team were highly dependent on that person for inspiration, for energy, for ideas. And so the team, this guiding light, I'm just see if I can move this up, ceased to flourish. It ceased to thrive anymore because of this lack of input from this person. So in this short story, we can perhaps see some dimensions of resilience, some dimensions of grounded resilience as you would apply it in your workplaces. We can see the thinker's resilience, how it's been pushed and tested to the limit. We can see my resilience, sometimes termed compassion resilience, as a coach who's dealing with a procession of these stories and descriptions and having to hold them in confidence. It can't be shared, can't talk about them, and that's absolutely in line with the code of ethics. But there is a strain, which is often experienced in caring professions. We can think about the levels of resilience of the person's team, the fact that once the person left the team, they were unable to perform as well. They sort of lost their mojo. We thought about how the organization, as it strives to change, has suddenly got to be resilient, has got to face adversity from the fact that this key motivator has left the building. We can think about what's happening with the coaches team as our energy drops due to this succession of conversations of this ilk. We're there to do a good job, we're there to talk about all the things that you would probably recognize as being great and successful, and yet somehow it's not coming together, it's not working. And there's another dimension we might notice as well, which is that particular manager. We often talk about resilience as being a very positive thing, but actually what we have there is resilience to change, resilience to changes that most of you would think are positive. So actually there's a dimension of when is resilience not working with us? When do we have to think about someone's resilience against the things that we want? So what I'd like to do then is we'll quickly define resilience, we'll have a look at some of the main thinkers behind it, and we can talk about psychological resistance rather than systems resilience, and then we'll go on to some quick and hopefully practical tips on what you can do to raise it within yourself, and we'll touch briefly on teams. I really like this definition. Resilience is the capacity of a system to deal with change and to continue to develop. In other words, it can carry on. This is where the jelly comes in. Jelly is often thought of as a resilient thing or system. What it actually has is flexibility, right? So it's fairly fragile, but you can push it, it will wobble, it'll bounce back to shape. What's interesting is, just like people in teams, it oscillates before it actually finds its stable state again. But really, this is flexibility. It's not perhaps true resilience. The reason is that resilience includes being faced with adversity or some kind of situation that causes pause for thought or more, and then the recovery cycle of getting back to a stable state, and then potentially going beyond that and thriving. The jelly, of course, just goes back to a stable state. And we can contrast this with, say, robustness, where robustness is toughness and ability to withstand and endure, while resilience is an ability to adapt, cope with, and move forward. And then if we want to, we could also consider something like anti-fragility, which is about, as far as I can tell, first of all, subjecting things to adversity and pressure to try and learn how they'll behave. And secondly, and adapting to circumstances that you haven't predicted or seen, and basically going beyond the baseline of recovery to become improved and new and better. So based on this potted description of what resilience is, I'd like to ask you a question about which of these two creatures is the most resilient. I'll just give you their stats first of all. So the tardigrade, it's a maximum of 1.2 millimeters in size. If you look really, really carefully, as in with a microscope, at the little yellow lichens that you see around the place where the air quality is good, there'll be tardigrades in there. Temperature survival range, between about -200 and 148 Celsius. They can survive in low Earth orbits, that's vacuum, and radiation. They'll eat just about anything, including themselves, when they get hungry. My cat, Cleo, on the other hand, she's about 23 centimeters long. She has a very small temperature range of around 10 centimeters and moves constantly to keep that temperature right. She can survive. She is incredibly picky about her food, as all cats are. So you know cats, and I don't need to explain them to you. But what I want to know then is which of these two is the most resilient? So who thinks a tardigrade is the most resilient? The one that you can throw into space and it'll still be alive. The one that you can dehydrate. The one that will live without water. Okay, a few people. Who thinks a cat is most resilient? Okay. Excellent. So I think we're slightly in favour of the tardigrade. Lots of hands didn't go up, and that's okay too. In fact, I would posit that the cat is the most resilient. The tardigrade just endures. It doesn't adapt. And the adaptation is a key part of resilience. It's a key part of getting better at things, adapting to circumstances and pressures, and coming through to be better. So, for instance, you can see cats that have had spinal injuries, and they will just walk around on their hands. It's incredible. They adapt incredibly well to brain injuries, to physical injuries in environments. Whereas the tardigrade, as I say, it just kind of hunkers down, dehydrates itself to the point of hibernation and stays there. It's about the only thing that will survive the apocalypse, and it's survived a load of mass extinction events, but it's still just toughness. The other definition I really like is this. Resilience is an active dynamic interaction with adversity. It waxes and wanes. So this is important. The amount of resilience will vary. And the immediate balance of resources, positive factors and risks. So resources is important in this. We're not, imagine that we had a resilience indicator. We're not necessarily as resilient now as we will be in 2 weeks if we're tired. Or right now I'm not particularly resilient as I've just taken every hay fever drug known to man, and it's making my brain do really odd things, not to mention my voice. But this is why we need to get good at resilience. If you think about performance, you think about change, think about wanting to get better at something, we don't do that just by standing still. We have to try things. And this pushes us away from our comfort zone. You know, I'm sure you're familiar with these terms like flow and trying to push yourself into spaces where you're learning and productive and just slightly challenged, just slightly uncomfortable. So we want to push ourselves there, and our agile practices are often pushing ourselves and teams and organizations as we try to change around them into these zones that are briefly uncomfortable but still productive. And resilience is our ability to survive in these, to bounce back and go again. And you can see, of course, that if the resilience runs out, if the resources that we looked at earlier run out, we head towards things like burnout, we start to disconnect, and so forth. So let's look at building up some resistance then. When you Google, when you Ecosia resilience, what you'll find is a whole load of things. There's a lot like this. A lovely hand with 4 triangles on, and thanks, I'm cured. That's all I need to know. But we can dig into it a bit more. This is Martin Seligman. He's often recognized as the father of positive psychology. He builds a lot on Albert Ellis's work as well. He is attributed as being one of the first psychologists to really say, right, let's stop trying to fix people. Let's see if we can learn to get better. Let's look at positive things and how to enhance those. Maybe we won't need to do so much remedial work. He popularized Perma, which is positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. We're going to dig into a variation of this shortly. The findings from positive psychology and from building resilience are very similar across the board. It's incredibly hard to cite all these in a talk. There'll be references at the end of the deck. But essentially, it tends to reduce depression, it brings faster healing, it brings a calmer mindset, and often people who have a positive psychology will actually live for longer. So it's worth looking into, it's worth considering. I really love this frame from The Power of Full Engagement. These are the people that talk about managing your energy, not your time. If you just let that sink in for a minute, it kind of implies that half the world is managing for the wrong thing. We're all thinking about time, but not energy. And really what matters is the quality of our time rather than the actual hours and numbers of our time. So this frame is really productive. And they talk about recharging, and they talk about having to keep these 4 aspects topped up. So your physical energy, food, diet, nutrition, sleep. Sorry, not food, diet, nutrition. Your mental energy, emotional, as in your feelings, and your spiritual energy, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, the battery metaphor is brilliant, and really, if you want to have a nap from this point, that's probably one of the most important things in the talk done. You've got 4 dimensions to your energy. You should think about recharging them. Don't think so much about time. However, the battery metaphor is slightly limited because it implies that any time we want to, we can just go and plug in and charge up one of those vital sources of energy. But it's not like that. it's much more like literal spinning of plates. And if you think about that metaphor, you need to give the plates, you need to give your energy levels attention when they require it, rather than later. Otherwise it's gone, it's on the floor, it's broken, you don't get to recharge it. The other thing that's relevant in this metaphor is the rhythm, the cycles. If we form a rhythm of recharging, hard work, input, and then we go again and again, we can sustain energy, high performance, much better than if we go for a long time without recharging, thinking about how to recharge. And the other thing when we're on spinning plates, it's not just us, right? It's the teams around us. Everyone is having to do the same thing. So I really like the frame of Rob Warner and Kurt April from their paper, which talks about these things to think about for resistance: connecting to purpose, using your unique strengths, maintaining perspective, generating positive feelings, being optimistic, persevering while being open-minded and flexible, and reaching out to others. Quick swig while everyone's photoing. And what's significant in this, and for the rest of the talk, all of these can be applied personally and across teams. So, if you're feeling a bit lost and unmotivated, maybe the purpose is gone, could also be true of the team. A team that's struggling and not enjoying things, maybe they're not playing to their strengths. Maybe they're not playing to the things that they came onto the organization for in the first place. We are just going to look at 4 of these, but I want to map them onto those energy sources that you saw earlier. So we'll look at generating positive feelings for emotional recharging. We'll look at connecting to purpose for spiritual. And what I want to highlight with spiritual is not about religion. It's about a thing that you care about enough that you find energizing and engaging. And there could be many sources of that, as we'll see shortly. The mental side, so maintaining perspective, and again, persevering by being flexible and adaptable. All right, so let's connect to our purpose or meaning. It looks like this sloth has found its purpose or meaning. This is Nadia Sparkles. Does anyone? So we're on this realistic theme. She's a schoolgirl in Norwich, and she got fed up with seeing loads and loads of rubbish on the way to school. So she said, right, I'm going to start picking up 3 things every day on the way to school. And then they picked it up in school, and they said, right, why doesn't everyone do that? And about that time, a couple of things happened. First of all, a number of people started to pick up trash on the way to school, but the other thing is she started to get bullied for it. But her purpose that she'd chosen of trying to clear up and safeguard the environment kept her going through the adversity of being bullied, and kind of simultaneously, she embraced that label. They could have started to call her trash girl at school, which is pretty dreadful, but she embraced it and said, well, yeah, maybe I am. That sounds like a superhero to me. I'm going to go out and do more of this and talk more strongly about it. She tapped into that as her source of resilience. And of course, it garnered support from all over the globe. It led to things like this, the trash tag. Anyone heard of this? Tried it? So essentially, it leads to all these impossibly attractive Instagram influencers going out to places with rubbish bags, cleaning up, and then taking photos of them lined up. There was a report that, or at least someone suggested you could game this, of course, by taking your trash to a place and then spreading it out. I've been inspired by this, so every time I go jogging, I take a trash bag with me, and if my knees give out, which is virtually every time, I can then gather some stuff up, take it out of the environment, and dispose of it safely and recycle it safely, which is kind of a Jane McGonigal, she is a gamer evangelist. She suffered from complications from concussion, and she suffered as a result of that from suicidal ideation. And she describes this moment where she realized it was getting so bad she had to take action. And because she was a gamer, she invented a game. At the time, it was called Jane the Concussion Slayer. And it involved looking for power-ups, things that made her feel better, look out the window, go for a short walk, tiny things. Looking out for the bad guys, the things that made it worse. And she gamified the whole system. And she also had looking for allies, people, social connection. And when she blogged about it, other folk got interested. And so she explained how the game worked. They began to report how effective it was. And it got turned into an app called Super Better. It works a little bit like objective key results in the sense that you choose your power-ups. It's entirely customizable for yourself, and then you measure achievement of that purpose. And it turns out that it's enormously successful, even when the prognosis is pretty grim. And this is an interesting frame. Has everyone seen Maslow's hierarchies of needs? I'm sure most of you, those of you who haven't, very briefly, it's all built up. It implies that the first thing we need to meet is our psychological needs. And then as we can progress up the pyramid, we can start to think about things like self-actualization, things like our purpose. But if you think about Nadia and you think about Jane and what they did, they turned it upside down. So their reason to live came first, and from that, they were able to think about and deal with the challenges and opportunities that came their way. Viktor Frankl, a psychologist, he famously elected to stay in a concentration camp because he felt he could do better work rather than taking up the offer of escape. And he describes this moment of incredible calm when he made that decision. It's like, well, I'm here and I'm going to do this, and chose to endure the hardship. And actually, you could argue that even this doesn't go far enough because it implies a layering and a building, and again, that very sort of mechanical arrangement. But our brains aren't like Lego blocks. It's much more like reinforcing cycles. So the other thing that's significant is maintaining perspective. There's no coincidence that when you look at coaching frameworks, they all have some kind of acceptance or understanding or situation or moment where you work with the person or yourself or the group to get a grounded understanding of what's happening. You try to cut out bias, opinion, and judgment, and just really see what's going on. And this is a valuable part of resilience, because often our self-talk is what is driving our negative emotions and the things that are not healthy for us and that stop us enjoying what we're doing. And so our perception of what's going on around us is crucial in determining how we go about things. That self-talk also applies to the words that you use. So I want to introduce you to these words that are going to limit your life and invite you to be wary of them. They're pretty innocuous as well. Always, must, never, can't, and tequila. Now, this is a little bit of NeuroLinguistic Programming, and there's also, again, it comes out of Albert Ellis's work on rational emotive behavior therapy. If I stand, I'll try it now actually, we'll see what happens. If I stand in front of you and say, I could never present to a busy room in Agile on the beach, you could probably immediately hear some nervousness coming up. That statement starts to become true in my mind, and I'm not fond of it. Were I to say something like, I would find it challenging to stand in front of a room full of all these bright people and to try and explain something, it immediately acknowledges the difficulty, but doesn't make it a barrier. It doesn't make it a truth or a rule in my head. So when we're being resilient, and also when we're talking to people in our teams and trying to encourage things to happen, the nature of our self-talk and the words that come out is significant. And it's also significant if the tequila comes out at work, but that's a different talk. So what I thought we might do very briefly is have a little play with that concept, if you don't mind. We're going to work through one of Seligman's exercises, again, based on Ellis's work. And what we're going to do is investigate some adversity or event that we're interested in. Well, you could frame it as an improvement you want to make if you like. We're going to look for an adversity. What's on my mind? So adversity I face frequently is the fact that my daughter doesn't sleep very well. I get woken up at night multiple times, and then I have to do things like go to work and so forth, just like everyone else. What are my beliefs about that adversity? Well, my beliefs are that I'll be a complete wreck, I'll hardly be able to talk, I'll need a lot of coffee, and that I can't function without sleep. What are the consequences of those beliefs? Well, the consequences are I drink a lot of coffee. The consequences are I'm probably going into work and meetings with a feeling that I'm not going to do well, and all sorts of others. What is the disputation? Now, this is where it gets interesting. This is where we're trying to bring grounding and we're trying to bring acceptance and realism to the situation. So you make a lawyerly case against yourself to say, right, Well, clearly you've got through every day when you've not had much sleep. You could probably survive without coffee because you've done that before. And it could be that actually your performance is acceptable or indeed good, and that people aren't noticing half as much as you suspect. All right, so what's energizing about that? That means, is there a change? Is there something interesting in the way you've tried to adjust your self-talk through going through this exercise? Well, one thing is I might feel more confident if I haven't slept that I can get through it. I can have some resilience to face that adversity. So, would you like to give that a quick try? Here's a description of what it is. What I'd invite you to do, first of all, is to think about, scribble it down. We're not going to share back, okay? So whatever you choose to write down or think about, entirely private. I'd encourage you to do this in silence and just have we'll just spend 2 or 3 minutes on it, so we'll be quick. But just give it a try and see how it works out for you. So think about an adversity, something in detail, a who, a what, a where, a when, a thing that's happened to you that matters. Okay, I'm not actually seeing much writing. Shall we do a straw poll and see if anyone's actually doing this? Because if we're not, we'll carry on, and that would be fine. It is late. A few nods. Okay, all right, great. Well, thank you. Let's carry on then. Everyone else can enjoy a quiet bit of mindfulness or daydreaming. That's cool. So beliefs then, how do you interpret that? And remember to focus on the feelings that it stirs up, things that come to mind. And then think about the consequences. Now, it's not the consequences of the adversity, it's the consequences of your beliefs. And this is where we start to head towards being able to challenge and think about them. And then finally, if you put on, well, not finally, the crucial step, if you put on your most loyally demeanor and then try and refute your beliefs, try and find holes in the argument, try and find reasons to disagree, construct an argument against yourself. And then finally, I'd invite you to think about what, if anything, has changed. Has your energy and your relationship with the original adversity changed? And what might you do about that? Okay, are we good to crack on? A few people just writing. Okay, thank you for having a go at that. Of course, you might like to practice it in a quieter place and give it a bit longer. But remember, the key principle here is to recognize the thing and then try and divorce yourself about it and look for your self-talk. What are you telling yourself about that thing? And what might be changed, or what might you alter? What might be a bias? So positive feelings then. We'll move on to that as another one of resilience and positive psychology. I want to introduce you to the Hedonic Treadmill, which, I'm sorry to say, on. I don't know if anyone's getting treatment for this. This is also, by the way, how we can make you as happy as millionaires. The Hedonic Treadmill essentially claims that when we have peaks of happiness, if you will, particularly after acquisition. Marketing plays to, and this is why we all think we'll be a lot happier when we win the lottery. But actually what happens, as you can see from the diagram behind me, there's a peak of happiness, and then you return to what is very roughly your average happiness level. There's academic studies on what happens to lottery winners, and their satisfaction, interestingly, increases more than most folk, but then their happiness doesn't really increase. They see this brief spike, exactly like this, and then they're after something else. It is, of course, this treadmill that drives us to try and achieve more, so it has some positive aspects. It's also this that has made us great at avoiding threats. But what it does mean is we get this baseline, and we often don't appreciate where we are, what we have, and the happiness levels that we already feel. It's a double whammy. There's a thing called effective forecasting, which means that we're not very good at predicting what will actually make us happy. And so if you're thinking about buying a thing, it's actually pretty unlikely, within reason, that that thing will make you as happy as you expect, unless it's a necessity. So it's worth having some deep thinking about this, and thinking about how to raise that sort of default happiness bar, that baseline, rather than going into these peaks and troughs that rely on external inputs. There's a really simple exercise that you can do for this, which is called gratitude journaling. You just write down three small things that you're appreciative of. You'll note, of course, that in a lot of religious systems, this is baked in, and interestingly, a lot of religious systems do further resilience according to the criteria that we've seen earlier. So this is really applicable to work, right? Especially if you're keeping week notes. Here's some of the great English people that do week notes. I'm sure there are more. James Cattell's works in Gov. He's particularly interesting because he is a ferocious week noter, but he talks about both work and professional things, work and personal things. Well worth looking him up. The act of writing these things down has a sort of purging and calming effect. It engages deliberate thought, but those gratitudes also raise our well-being, and they sensitize us to look for good things. And of course, generally, what we do, and particularly in Agile teams, where we're looking out for things to correct or improve, we would tend to look at negative and what can I do better, rather than taking a minute to think about what's good and what's already working. As I said, the principle can apply to retrospectives. Kudo cards up there from Management 3.0, you can use those retrospectives. The 360 gratitudes retrospective, you can just Google these things. I've done it again. You can look these up online. And there was one time when I was doing a talk, and I noticed that I'd acquired this habit of calling everyone guys from my friend Rebecca. So I wanted to stop that. So I gave the front row Nerf guns and said, right, shoot me every time I use guys. I think I need to do that with search engines again. So go to a search engine and Google something and... Right, where's the Nerf guns? So, you can look this stuff up, right? That's why the references aren't on this page. Gratitude retrospective, appreciative retrospective is all there for you to use. And maybe it's worth doing that once in a while. Or if you're doing the more conventional retrospective formats, make sure there's something positive in there. It'll help your personal resilience and it'll help the team's resilience. Okay, so the next phase in Rob's resilience framework was persevering by being open-minded and flexible. Now, we should be great at this, right, as Agilists? And I think we are, really. There's this phrase, adaptive thinking, which came out of the Air Force in the Vietnam War in the States. They found, and this might sound like a familiar tale, they found that they were sustaining high casualties in dogfights. And so they were trying to figure out what was going on, and they realized that their pilots had been trained in a very linear, strategic way, and they weren't adapting to the circumstances of what was going on around them. And when they were flying, they were just being outgunned by people who had less training, inferior machines, but thought quicker. And it led to things like the OODA loop being created. And, it sounds like it could be a good film, but I haven't really thought about that too hard. what they found was that the elements of adaptive thinking that mattered were effective planning, monitoring of progress, and flexibly shifting your thinking behavior. Now, in our Agile environments, we think we're good at this stuff, and I'm sure we are, but I still feel like there's more to do with this. We should think about adaptive thinking styles and whether we're giving our best to the context and the challenges that are around us. It almost feels like this is a thing that should be taught individually. There's a couple of practices that you can do to raise this up and try and get good at it yourself. Divergent thinking. So this is where you look for other solutions. We often, in a meeting or similar forum, we'll jump to the first thing, groupthink will kick in, and we'll all just stay with that. But actually, if we train ourselves to do opportunity scanning, look for 10 different things, and then decide which one works, we're engaging in divergent thinking. So we are challenging our minds to think differently, to adapt, and look at differences. Deliberate practice. Has everyone heard of deliberate practice as a thing? So it involves imagining, talking through, walking through how you want things to be. It turns out it's almost as good as doing the thing in reality. But the other side of it is to deliberately practice what would happen if you encountered adversity. Think about what went wrong. I'm sure you've heard of project postmortems, where after the project you look at what's happened. Well, you can do a pre-mortem. You can imagine it's been a disaster and then work out what led to that. And then maybe you can head off some of those things. Maybe you can do something about it. Focused iterations of deep thought. Again, this is interesting in Agile environments where we're cross-functional, we're collaborating all the time. You know, are we giving space for people to think and really bring their best and have quality thinking time? The suggestion is that if we work in short sprints of concentration, like the Pomodoro technique, we'll get more done, we'll feel a level of quietness, and we'll be recharging. Right. I'm going quite quick because I feel like I'm running out of time a bit. Apologies for that. So there's some barriers to resilience that it's worth thinking about. Personalization. So this is where we believe we're to blame for everything. So let's imagine that, well, we don't need to imagine, I'm going very quickly, and let's imagine that I blame myself for going through it and not touching on the detail, not taking you to the places I wanted, and not highlighting the things that I would have liked you to have learned. So I leave the conference, and I feel like the conference has been a failure, and I'm miserable, and I feel like it's all on me. And then that miserableness becomes pervasive. In other words, it starts to affect other parts of my life. So I get on the train and I'm miserable to the passengers around me, and they all get miserable, and I get home, and I take my miserableness there, and my belief is that my internal thoughts are affecting everything around me. This is pervasiveness. And then there's permanence. If I believe that I'm miserable all the time, and that I will always be miserable because of rushing through this talk here today, next year, if I'm lucky enough to be selected, I will walk on stage being miserable again because of permanence. So these are key things that we need to look out for in terms of being resilient to adversity. We need to recognize they don't last forever. If something fails, it doesn't mean that you are a failure, simply the thing has happened. And the pervasiveness. So doing poorly in a talk here does not mean that I'm a bad jogger, for example. All right, so let's have some conclusions. So first of all, you might be wondering why there's this unprecedented level of cuteness in this talk, which is not very like me. It's because I've been secretly raising your resilience levels. Sorry about that. Essentially, positive thoughts. I talked about the value of them and how they contribute to our well-being, raise our resilience, and make us feel better. If we increase our ratio of positive to negative thoughts, we experience less stress, we experience all the benefits I mentioned earlier. So, cute things and a connection with any living thing. This is what I found really fascinating. Of course, cute things are great, people are all right, but it actually also works with a plant as well. Anything living. We haven't really talked about the dimension of social and building relationships in resilience. It's obviously pretty key. Just in case there happen to be any introverts in the room, there's a paper that shows that you only need to interact with one person once every 3 weeks to get your top up of necessary social interaction. Read into that what you will. I talked about these 4 frames of building energy. the hierarchy of needs and how actually probably your purpose is, and the team's purpose, is the thing that determines how it feels and how it performs. And if there's any disquiet, these are the two things to look for. Are we lacking in one of these areas as people or teams? And are we losing out on our purpose? This is often where it comes to a head. If you think about the story that I opened with around the coaching, what could be done, what could be different about resilience? Well, if there's a tighter connection to purpose, we may well have seen better alignment between the manager, the organization, the team, and the person. We might have seen social networks providing resilience and backup for the people in the room. Now, it's also... Sorry, I'm just pondering whether I've got time to do this one. I did. Okay. So I want to leave you with this quote instead. It is this. When you're thinking about resilience, when you're thinking about the big stuff and the small stuff, you can't stop the waves, but you could learn to surf. And I'm done. I think we have time for a couple of questions.